But I say Berkeley? No. The town of Berkeley, California, was named after our philosophy, Berkeley. It got lost in translation. Berkeley, along with Hume and Locke, comprised the biggest figures in British empiricism. In what century? It follows...
Locke was in the 17th century. Berkeley and Hume were in the 18th century.
Yeah. So these guys followed on the heels of Descartes and very much were responding to the questions he raised. Questions, as you had just said, about what does it mean to know something? How do we know stuff is true? And yet they said, and the reason they're called empiricists, is we get most of our knowledge through our senses. Can you explain that for me? And then I'll tell you why I fought with you to make Berkeley our main man rather than Hume, who was the more intuitive choice.
Okay, yeah. All of these guys, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, are called empiricists because empiricism means experience. And what they were saying was that all of our knowledge of the external world comes to us through our five senses. That's a radical departure in philosophy. We spoke a moment ago of these guys before Descartes who would sit and take thought about the nature of reality. I said, you can't do that. Your only source of information about the external world is sensory information. That's all you got.
Does this assume that we are sort of a tabula rasa, that we're a blank slate that takes in this information?
Actually, that's what John Locke called it. He said the mind at birth is a blank slate, tabula rasa.
But then, of course, and this is where I just fell in love with Bishop Berkeley, George Berkeley, you have to account for, well, where is this sensory, this empirical information coming from?
Back in the Middle Ages, the assumption was that in the so-called material world, the reason it is the material world is there's something out there called matter. And that matter, according to the ancient philosophers and the medieval philosophers, was sort of a substratum. In that substratum inhered sensory qualities. Some matter is hard, some of it's soft, some of it's yellow, some of it's blue. And these qualities somehow inhered, was their word. They inhered in this substratum called matter.
Let me interrupt you. Are you suggesting, or were they suggesting, that the substratum itself is something apart from the sense data that it's giving off?
Yeah, that was sort of implicit in what they were saying. And that's where the empiricists took off. And they said, well, wait a minute. The only knowledge we have of the external world is through our senses. And this substratum apparently is something you can't see, smell, or touch. If you could see, smell, or touch it, it would be sensory qualities that inhered in it.
Yeah, didn't Kant later call this the Ding an sich, the thing in itself?
Yeah, except he didn't even want to say it was matter. He wanted to say we didn't know anything about it.
Okay.
Yeah. But these guys came along and they said, well, wait a minute. What evidence do we have that there's any substratum out there? All we know is the sensory qualities. So we have no reason to say that there's a material substrate. So Berkeley sort of took that to its logical extreme. And he said, well, since we have no evidence of that, then to be, he said, esse est percipi. All we mean by something existing is that it's perceived. That's all we mean. There is no reason to think that our sensory experiences are anything other than sensory experiences. They're experiences. And so he said, well, then how do we have them? And that's where he trickily brings in God. And he says, well, God is sort of zapping our minds.
With his telegraph machine in the sky, yeah.
And that's not the part that we remember Berkeley for. But the part we remember him for is his radical skepticism. Yeah. And his saying, if you can't say anything about the sensory qualities of something, don't say anything. And there's nothing we can say about matter, so leave matter out of the equation.
Just to bring a personal note here, is when we were kids and we were reading Berkeley, in our late teens, and I read this esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. I remember having my first sort of philosophical aha experience. And later I had a, pop in the head, gee, he thinks that's all it means for an object to exist, that we only have sense perceptions. And it kind of threw me back to the solipsistic universe of Descartes a little bit. It's all in my head. But then you say, well, somebody will say to you, well, everybody else is behaving as if they're the same objects, and then the Berkeley voice in your head says, yeah, but those people are just in your head too. And so why should we read this? I mean, this is the third one we've put up there on the big bulletin board.
Well, we picked Berkeley because it's more fun, because of the sort of mind game that he played. But all of these guys put a whole new slant on the way we think about the world, and that was the empiricist slant. And so the other thing that was developing simultaneously with these guys' philosophies was the outbreak of modern science. You know, Copernicus and Kepler and Newton and Galileo, all these guys were breaking through with a new way of looking at the world. And it was revolutionary because they were saying, again, you don't sit in a corner and think about the nature of the universe. You observe it, you measure it, you know, you look at it, you record the information, you make guesses as to what the probable outcome of experiments will be, and then you do those experiments. This was all stuff acting on evidence of our senses.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to make.
And it was a dialectical thing. You know, the scientists influenced the way these guys thought, but the way these guys thought and recorded it influenced the way scientists thought. And so it was really part and parcel of the scientific revolution.
Okay, should we move on to somebody who says the heck with reason?
Sure.